Yes.
Yes. Uh, Good morning. This is Mike O'Grady, Legislative Counsel. As the chair just referenced, I'm going to go over for you an overview of water quality law because you have undoubtedly heard over the past couple of weeks that there's been a dispute between US EPA and the state regarding how the state regulates agricultural water quality and specifically point source discharges from farms. And it's kind of a long and winding road to get where we are today. And I need to give you some context for that because how you respond to EPA's objection is ultimately a policy decision for the legislature. Whether or not you do what the advocates are requesting of shifting all of the ag water quality program from the Agency of Ag to the Agency of Natural Resources, or you do what the administration of state agencies are requesting or fixing the specific things that EPA objected to. And that's policy. That's for you to decide. EPA can't order that the Agency of Ag water quality program be shifted. They can only order that the delegated agency, ANR, do it better or withdraw it. And so that's kind of, you are going to need to make a policy decision as the General Assembly. And to do that, I think you need some context for what actually happened. And so I'm going way back in time to 1972. Congress passed the Clean Water Act. It's actually amending a previous act, the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, which remains the controlling law. The Clean Water Act is multi-purpose. It has tons of things in the Clean Water Act. It's not just about discharges. It's about water quality. It's about wetlands. It's about funding. The state gets a ton of money from the feds through the Clean Water Act every year. And the ultimate purpose of the Clean Water Act is to prevent, reduce, and eliminate pollution in the nation's water in order to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's water. And they do that largely through two programs. They largely do it through the permitting program and the water quality program. So the discharge program, the permit program, is about when there is a discharge of pollutants to a navigable water. That is prohibited unless the discharger has a permit from US EPA or a delegated state. So a pollutant is pretty much anything. It's pretty much anything you can think of, anything added to or anything that modifies the water. Heat, if you draw water in to cool a turbine and then discharge it out and it's hotter than it was when you drew it in, that's a pollutant. So the pollutant is pretty much anything you can think of. And the navigable waters has been an issue over the past couple of years because it's not defined really in the Clean Water Act. It just says that they're waters of the United States, including the territorial seas. Well, what does that mean? Navigable water. Well, it said waters of the United States in the EPA rules. And when EPA fleshed that out in their rules, they said it's your actual waters that you can float a boat on, the territorial seas, which is 12 miles from the coast, interstate waters, including interstate wetlands, and tributaries of those navigable waters. But it also said that it was waters that significantly affect the chemical, physical, or biological integrity of waters, including wetlands that significantly affect the chemical, physical, or biological integrity of water. Now, that was a problem for a lot of people because that meant that wetlands that weren't surface connected to navigable waters or their tributaries were being regulated by US EPA, and it was making them go through a permit process that they didn't think they needed to go through. So there was a decision, there was litigation and a decision in a case called Sackett versus EPA that said, no, those waters that significantly affect aren't waters of the United States unless there's a surface connection between the tributary, that navigable water, and the wetland. So wetlands that are remote from a navigable water or its tributary is no longer water of the United States under the Clean Water Act. That doesn't mean that everybody can just go start discharging into remote wetlands and digging up remote wetlands, because Vermont's program is more strict. It has additional requirements than the federal program. They have the ability to regulate to a higher standard, and the state has done that. So in Vermont, the discharge standard is no person shall discharge any waste, substance, or material into waters of the state. And waters of the state, it's a small text there down on the right-hand side. It's anything. It's all rivers, streams, creeks, brooks, reservoirs, ponds, lakes, springs, and all bodies of surface water, artificial or natural. And in the past couple of years that you've clarified, the General Assembly's clarified that waters also include discharges to wetlands. So even though Sackett said there has to be a surface connection between the wetland and the water, in Vermont, you don't need that surface connection. So any discharge into a wetland, it has to be a significant wetland, which means it's a class 1 or a class 2 wetland.
Mike, let me just make sure that we're all good, because I think it's this important foundational understanding. The Clean Water Act, federal law, applies to any body of water that ultimately ends up in a river or a lake, one of the 4 main rivers or lakes that our basins are. But then Vermont law goes further and says it's this, whatever the Clean Water Act requires, the state is also requiring the same thing for any water that doesn't drain.
And I bring this up because this is going to be one of the policy decisions you're going to have to address. Because when we get to it, regulating a concentrated animal feeding operation under the Clean Water Act, you can only regulate them when there's an actual discharge. An actual discharge. So if you have this definition of discharge and the definition of waters here, you're pretty much going to bring in every farm. You're going to have to address how you define a discharge and what that discharge is to, if you're going to basically comply with EPA's directive.
From a practical standpoint, are there farms that, if they were to discharge, would end up not polluting under the Clean Water Act because the flow, the way the slopes are, the water doesn't flow out into a tributary, so they're not connected from a practical standpoint?
It's possible, but could I just answer that in like 5 more minutes?
Absolutely. Yes, that's always a good response.
Because I got to give you a little bit more context for
Okay.
how that farm is going to be regulated, because it's regulated in 2 different ways under the Clean Water Act structure.
Would you like to keep going then?
Yeah, if you don't mind.
We'll hold questions for a couple more minutes. Yeah.
So there's a bunch of Vermont specific permitting beyond what the Federal Clean Water Act is. I'm not going to go into all of them. But what the Federal Clean Water Act requires is that if there's certain types of discharges that EPA or a delegated state needs to permit that certain type of discharge. And one of those certain types of discharges are discharges from a concentrated animal feeding operation. And that's because when you look at the definition of a point source, so remember, you can't discharge a pollutant from a point source into a navigable water or water of the United States without a Federal Clean Water Act permit. A point source is defined as a ditch, a pipe, a conduit, and a concentrated animal feeding operation. A farm is the same thing as a pipe. except for agricultural stormwater discharge. So first, you got to separate those two things. The pipe really is the production area. It's where you have had animals for 45 days or more, where they're being fed or confined, 45 days or more over the course of a year, and vegetation has been denuded from that area. It's basically where your milk house is, where your corral may be, where the animals are. So that's your production facility and the buildings and the concrete and the impervious surface around. If you have a discharge coming off of that, going into a water of the United States, that has to be permitted. Now, while out in the field, where the farmer is applying manure, fertilizer, nutrients, that is where the agricultural stormwater exemption comes into play. The courts and the EPA have said if the farmer is applying those nutrients, those inputs, according to site-specific conditions, then they are exempt from a discharge permit. And so for that activity, for the application of those inputs. Now, site-specific conditions has been interpreted to meet a nutrient management plan, and it has to meet the NRCS called the 590 standard for nutrient management plans. And how extensive your nutrient management plan is really depends on how extensive your farm is and how much inputs you are using on your farm. They can be pretty significant documents, right? And they can be, I don't think they're even publishing them much anymore. It's all electronic largely, but they're very technical, and they relate to each field and the soil in each field and what you can do in the soil in each field. And if you're complying with that, then you are exempt from a discharge permit for that activity. Now, things happen. There was a case of probably about 10 years ago now. Pretty significant farm, Franklin County. Farmers knew what they were doing. They hired a custom applicator. It's somebody you hire to apply manure on your fields. The custom applicator's equipment broke. The manure wagon tipped over. The load ran across that farmer's field, ran across a neighboring field into Lake Champlain. That's not site-specific conditions, right? They weren't complying with their nutrient management plan. That was a discharge. There was an enforcement action. But does that need a permit? Because it could be fixed, right? That wasn't an ongoing issue. That was a one-time issue. And so one of the things you have to kind of contemplate when you're making your policy decision is how those kind of one-time issues are regulated. If you get it fixed, does it mean that that farm has to go into the concentrated, the A&R permit program? Even though that technically was a discharge, they had a discharge. CAFOs are supposed to have a discharge permit when they have a discharge. But that was an error, not an ongoing discharge. And so that's something you have to talk to the agencies about and how they are going to go forward in those kind of situations. Does that error bring that farm into the A&R program? And it is an A&R program because EPA delegated that NPDES permit program to A&R in 1974. And so EPA has been relying on A&R to issue NPDES permits since 1974. Well, and we'll come back to this in a minute, A&R hasn't issued one permit to a CAFO since 1974 and really since 2003.
Okay, open it up for
One quick question.
Yeah.
What does CAFO stand
concentrated animal feeding operation. It's that where you've got those animals for 45 days where they're being fed or confined, and the vegetation in that area has been denuded.
Is there a number of animals that is in the definition?
That depends on we call it the Noah's Ark. Because you start with the large, and for dairy, it's 700 or more. For medium, it's 200 to 699, and small is anything under that. If you have a discharge from a medium or a large, you need a permit under the Federal Clean Water Act. If it's a small, there's this kind of process analysis that goes on to determine whether or not you are an AFO. And if you are an AFO, whether or not you're a significantly small AFO contributing. And so that there's a bit of a process for the smaller ones. But medium and large would need a discharge permit if there's an actual discharge.
I had a question.
Yeah, I was wondering if, we always hear during floods that sewage treatment plants, let a certain amount go. Are those synonymous then with that rollover of the manure spreader in the field? I mean, are they considered accidents and there's not an enforcement?
No, they're not. They're not, because those systems are designed to work that way. The Romans built those, like the first people to use them were the Romans, right? Because it's ingenious. It's like you have to deal with the pressure in your infrastructure. And at some point, if there's too much volume, you have to let the pressure off or your infrastructure is going to be destroyed. And so that's what those CSOs do. It's just that they were designed and built in the 50s when you weren't talking about what the phosphorus levels were of Lake Champlain, what the E. coli levels were in Memphremagog. But now you are, and now you know that combining that wastewater with stormwater is an invitation to pollution, especially in high weather events, which are increasing more and more.
But they're not considered violations yet.
Well, there is a permit for them. They have a schedule. That schedule is requiring them to eliminate that combination over time. And the towns that have them have been doing significant work to get rid of them. They're really expensive to get rid of. And nobody's going to like this, especially in this committee, the contribution of phosphorus from those is much less than the contribution of phosphorus from other sources. So if you're going to look at a bang for your buck fix and trying to reduce the most load, they're not the biggest priority. Nobody likes to hear that because nobody likes to see a plume of brown water going into Lake Champlain and then a farmer saying, well, I have to do all this $1 million worth of work. Why can't they do that? Well, they're supposed to be doing it and they're supposed to be doing it over time. But it's a bang for a buck from them.
I'm going to just ask the committee to hold questions for a few more minutes to make sure that Mike gets enough into the presentation.
So before we get to the current ag water quality scenario, you have to realize that the second major part of the Federal Clean Water Act is it requires all states to establish water quality standards to ensure that the traditional designated uses of the water are maintained. In Vermont, traditional designated waters are some of the intuitive ones: public water supply, recreation, boating, swimming, but it also includes aesthetics. It's also irrigation. It's also aquatic biota and aquatic habitat. Every 2 years.
Michael, can you just say, what is aquatic biota?
Aquatic biota is the animals, the organisms that are in the water.
Animals that live in the water. Got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So every 2 years, ANR has to go out and assess the water quality of all the waters in the state, and they issue a report And generally, the waters are in pretty good condition. From the 2016 report, about 75% of all the waters in the state are in good condition. But when those waters, and you can find that water quality assessment report at that link that I provided. But if those waters aren't meeting standards, if the designated uses are not being supported, for some reason you can't recreate in the water, you can't boat in it, you can't use it for irrigation, then that water is impaired. When a water is impaired, the Federal Clean Water Act requires the state to come up with a plan to bring it back into attainment so that those traditional uses that were impaired can be implemented again. And that plan is called a total maximum daily load. Now, every 3 years, ANR has to go out and find all the impaired waters. And they have a list of impaired waters. And that's called the 303D list. And there are impaired waters in every watershed. It's not just Champlain. It's not meant for Magog. Just meant for, there's Carmi, there's Otter Creek, there's the Winooski, there's the Hoosick. They are in every one of the basins in Vermont. And what are the causes of impairments? Well, it depends. It depends on what use is being prevented from occurring. It could be from flow, from stormwater and scouring of the stream banks, which is what happened in what are called the stormwater impaired waters, largely in Chittenden County. It could be from phosphorus runoff, which is coming from stormwater from developed lands, or it could be coming from agricultural runoff, or it could be coming from your wastewater treatment plant. So, but it could be other things. It could be PCBs, it could be E. coli, could be chloride, it could be whatever is in that water that is preventing that traditional use could be the cause of the impairment. And the 303D list lists all of that. It'll tell you what water or what segment of the water is impaired, and it'll tell you what uses are impaired, and it'll tell you why.
Representative O'Brien.
Just quickly, can invasives cause impairment?
Technically, yes, but they have a different list for invasives. There's like 4 lists. There's the 303D list, which is those waters that are impaired and don't have a TMDL. There's the 303B, that those waters that are impaired that have a TMDL. There's the aquatic nuisance stress list, the invasives list, and then there's the stress list. There's the waters that are on edge for some reason and could be impaired or could be affected by aquatic invasives. So and they deal with them differently. So what is a TMDL? TMDL is a target. It's like your budget. It's what you want to meet so that you are still discharging. Phosphorus is still going into it, or whatever pollutant is still going into it, but you are still supporting those designated uses. So it's effectively the maximum amount of pollutant allowed to enter water from existing sources so that the water will meet and continue to meet water quality standards. So there are basically 2 types of pollutants where the pollutants are coming from. There's the point source out of the pipe. There's the non-point source, which is the overland flow, largely stormwater. And when you have those 2 different types, point source and non-point source, as the cause of your impairment, you have to come up with a formula. You have to figure out the maximum amount of point source load, and then the maximum amount of non-point source load, and then you have to build in a margin of safety, because non-point source is determined by rain. And you can't predict the rain, so you have to build a margin of safety into your formula. So it's WLA, maximum WLA, plus LA, plus MOS, margin of safety. That's the formula. And that's the formula that EPA used to come up with the Lake Champlain TMDL. They looked at all the different things that you did as a state, and they attributed through a model a load reduction to each one of those programs. And they expected those load reductions to be met. So you'll talk about this year, probably, maybe not in this committee, but maybe in other committees, about changing some of those programs. If you change some of those programs, you've got to ensure that the load that EPA wanted is met somewhere else or somehow else. And so it's like basically adding up 2 + 2 + 2, where your goal is to get to 100. Like, how, if you take one of those twos away, you're only going to get to 98. Well, how are you going to get back to 100? And that's basically what a TMDL is. And there are options for how you achieve that budget, how you achieve that target. And generally, those options are in what's called an implementation plan. And when Vermont was faced with the second TMDL for Lake Champlain, EPA technically was the one that was supposed to adopt that TMDL and adopt the implementation plan, because EPA disapproved the original TMDL. And under the Federal Clean Water Act, when EPA disapproves a TMDL, they have to issue it themselves. And they have to issue it within like 90 days. Well, 3.5 years later, after they disapproved it, they issued it. And that was probably a good thing, because in those 3.5 years, the state was able to negotiate with EPA how to achieve the TMDL without relying solely on EPA's permitting authority. Now, what were the alternatives? So EPA has kind of relatively limited enforcement authority. They enforce through the direct discharge program. So they require permits for construction that disturbs the earth. They require municipal wastewater permits. They require industrial wastewater permits. They require industrial stormwater permits. They require municipal stormwater permits. And that's really all they have, plus the CAFO program. Now, Vermont has all of that NPDES authority, all the authority that EPA had, but it could create new programs. Remember, Vermont can go higher than the EPA. It can be more strict than the EPA. It can create new programs that are not required by the EPA. And that's what was proposed by Vermont to EPA. And it was proposed because it was, again, a bang for the buck scenario. Because what EPA could have done is required all municipal wastewater treatment plants to go to 0.1 phosphorus or even 0. And that would have been tens and tens of millions of dollars, and it would not have achieved much load reduction. It could have required every single farm in the state to get a CAFO permit, but that would have been tens and tens of millions of dollars, and there wouldn't have been actual discharges from some of those farms, and there wouldn't have been sufficient load reduction from that kind of a requirement. So what did EPA actually approve? Well, the state negotiated it, and what they came up with was multiple different programs. So the state proposed that they'll do some work on wastewater treatment facilities. They'll do some work with the municipal stormwater, the MS4 communities. They will do work with concentrated animal feeding operation discharges. They will implement new programs for stormwater developed lands, the 3-acre permit. I'm sure you've heard of the 3-acre permit, and if you haven't, you will. And they required municipal road stormwater. So the state went out and did a bunch of work, implemented multiple programs or proposed these programs in order to meet the TMDL and to achieve the goal of a cleaner lake, one that met the water quality standards. But you didn't actually have the authority to do that. Well, EPA didn't have the authority to require it. You had to implement it. You had to adopt Act 64, which was the statute which created all of those additional state programs which achieved the load in a more bang for the buck way than what EPA could have done. And one of those programs was the Vermont Clean Water Fund. And this is the fund that provides significant ongoing financing for the Clean Water Initiative. And EPA required this as part of the implementation plan. So it has revenues from the property transfer tax surcharge. It has revenues from 6% of the revenues on meals and rooms taxes, it has all the unclaimed beverage container deposits. And that's approximately, it's like $45 to $50 million a year that's in the Clean Water Fund. That money is expended. The governor comes to you, the way that the statute is set up, the Clean Water Fund just doesn't give money directly to grantees. What they do is they have a budget, they propose that budget to the governor then proposes that budget to the General Assembly. The General Assembly appropriates the money as it sees fit, not always consistent with the Clean Water Fund budget. And then that money goes out. So you control how the Clean Water Fund is used. You just do it kind of on a 6-month delay based on the fiscal year appropriations. But let's talk about ag. So,
Mike, let me just pause and see whether anybody has a question that they really need answered just for clarity's sake or something else that's critical before we go on.
Just to remind us, we were looking at the Clean Water Fund for a funding source, weren't we, last year, maybe for the log landing?
Yeah, we did have testimony on the process that Mike just outlined, and then where the money was being spent. And we ultimately didn't think use money from that, but the law, we were having a conversation about the logging grant money.
Yeah.
So over the years, you have required A&R and the Agency of Agriculture and the Clean Water Fund Board and the Secretary of Administration to report to you in many different ways and many different reports how the efforts are going for cleaning up the waters of the state. And the administration basically consolidated all those requirements into one report. It's called the Clean Water Initiative Report. And you'll see all the different reporting requirements that are included in this report. One of the things that it provides you information with is how the money is spent. So by land use sector, you'll see that it's by far agriculture is where the most money has been spent, especially when you look at state grants and contracts. And then when you look at wastewater, you'll see that wastewater is much less about state grants and contracts. It's about loans because there's the state revolving loan fund that gives low to no interest loans to municipalities to implement their wastewater improvements. And then you'll see the different stages of how that money has been spent. But you also need to look at where the gains have been. That yellow, that indicates the load reduction from agriculture. So comparatively to the other sources, agriculture is achieving the most reduction underneath the TMDL, as indicated by the Clean Water Initiative. So ag, people are telling you that ag aren't doing their part. Well, that's not what the Clean Water Initiative is indicating. Now, some will say, well, that's an overestimate. Even so, there's still a significant reduction coming from agriculture.
Just before I get to Representative Burt, I think when we saw this chart last spring, somebody pointed out that the yellow bar was lower on 2023 we were heading, it's just, the trend had been upwards and then 2023 number was down a little bit. Maybe too soon to say there's a new trend, but just.
So this is load reduction. And remember that load is a function of two things, what comes out of your point source and what comes over your land, your non-point source. In 2022 to 2023, there were significant weather events, right? And so the amount of load from non-point source was probably greater, so the amount of load reduction was less. I think you're probably going to see that bar fluctuate back up in the next report.
So you Representative Byrd?
Jim, natural resources is green. What does that mean in terms of reduction?
So there's actually load that comes just off the forest.
Just off of
Right.
off of nature.
Yeah, and so part of dealing with that is when there's activity in the forest harvesting, the harvester is supposed to implement what are called the accepted management practices for timber harvesting. And so you'll get some load reduction from that. But there's also some other natural resources, things that are done like stream bank stabilization, because sediment is a delivers phosphorus. So if you can do things to shore up stream banks, to eliminate natural resources causes, like most farms have that area where water collects just because that's where it collects. And that you have those on other areas as well. And so those are sources that A&R, not just on farms, but A&R goes out to try to fix. That's where you're getting that.
And then one other question, where does in the yellow, and the one on the right, where does wastewater factor in there? Is it just in the red on the stormwater or?
No, I think honestly, because I think you're probably not seeing much load reduction from wastewater. That they quantify the largest sources in load reduction. And those I think are probably the most quantifiable.
Because the load reduction isn't necessarily being reduced, or there isn't much load reduction happening.
From wastewater. Yeah.
Which means there isn't a whole lot of improvement happening there to help the TMD.
So back over here, so wastewater is largely funded through that loan program.
Yeah.
And that loan program has a line. And so there's a lot of demand for it. Remember at the very beginning, I said the Clean Water Act provides substantial amount of funding. Well, it's a substantial amount, but it's not enough to deal with all of those problems immediately. So there is some lag in wastewater in fixing those issues. And it's also because it's really, really expensive.
Yeah.
Representative Nelson.
So looking at the yellow bars on Memphremagog to run more even, is that how many metric tons per year we're reducing, or is that year over year, Mike?
It's metric ton per year.
So agriculture is kind of hit a plateau right now. Is that what we're seeing?
I wouldn't call it a plateau. I think it has consistent reduction.
Mhm.
And I do think you're going to see some fluctuations like you saw in 2023 that are likely weather dependent.
Stall the flooding.
Yeah, and when I look at that and, you look where we started in 2016 and then 17 and 18, and we jump. I relate that to weight gain. I can lose weight a lot faster than Greg can. until I get to a certain level. Cause it's easy, you know, when you start off wrong. When you start to make corrections, you make corrections, you can really drive the ball. And we have a meeting at Magog Watershed in February on a Monday, so I can be there. And I think we're gonna see our phosphorus numbers will drop significantly in the lake last 5 years.
So that's what the Clean Water Initiative gives you. Well, let's talk about water quality enforcement. We already talked about the permit programs that ANR does because they're an EPA delegated state, construction, industrial wastewater, municipal wastewater, etc. But the Agency of Agriculture has enforcement authority over a non-point source pollution program, agricultural water quality program. Now, the enforcement mechanisms are very similar, same types of authority, relatively same types of penalties. And there's an MOU that's required by statute so that the two agencies are directed to work together. So when the jurisdiction of one entity, most likely ANR, is triggered, that ANR can exercise its authority and potentially require a CAFO permit for a farm that's actually discharged. You can see the existing MOU and the link for it is there on the page if you want to go check out that MOU. And why is it set up like this? Why is it set up with two agencies doing ag water quality? Well, that's because EPA encouraged. In 2003, EPA issued a rule which required all states to implement, that were delegated states, to implement a CAFO permit program. But in their preamble, they said, this rule establishes binding legal requirements for large CAFOs and maintains substantial flexibility for states to set other site-specific requirements for CAFOs as needed to achieve state program objectives. And this is the line. EPA encourages states to maximize use of voluntary and other non-NPDES programs to support efforts by medium and small operations to implement appropriate measures and correct problems that might otherwise cause them to be defined or designated as a CAFO. EPA encourages states to use the flexibility available under the rule so that their state non-NPDES programs complement the required regulatory program. The following examples can illustrate opportunities for the state flexibility. States are encouraged to work with state agricultural agencies, conservation districts, USDA, and other stakeholders to create proactive programs to fix the problems of small and medium operations in advance of compelling the facilities to apply for NPDES permits. What does that all mean? EPA said, hey, if you can set up a program that encourages your farms not to discharge and not need a NPDES permit, go ahead and do that. And hey, by the way, do it through your state agricultural agency. And that's what Vermont did. They set up a program. They put that program in the Agency of Agriculture. They adopt standards called the Required Agricultural Practices, which prohibited farms from discharging. Prohibited farms from discharging. All farms in Vermont are prohibited from discharge. Do they? Some do, yes. And that's where the tension comes in between the Agency of Ag program, where there's a prohibited discharge, and the ANR program, where you're supposed to have a CAFO permit for an actual discharge. That MOU that those two agencies have is supposed to work so that when Agency of Ag sees an actual discharge, they notify ANR, and ANR decides whether or not to issue a CAFO permit for that actual discharge at that CAFO. Well, that's not happening. It's not. And because it wasn't happening, there's options that advocates or others have under the Federal Clean Water Act to try to make it happen. The Federal Clean Water Act has something called citizen suit authority, and there's two components of citizen suit authority. I could sue Representative Nelson and say he has a discharge at his property and he needs a permit. But before I actually sue him, I have to notify A&R that I'm going to do that. And then A&R has the opportunity to implement an action to diligently enforce, and my suit doesn't go forward because A&R suit is going forward. So you don't see many individual on individual citizen suits because the agencies step in and diligently prosecute because they don't want multiple individuals out there trying to enforce state or federal law. But the second component of the citizen suit authority is you can sue EPA, and you can sue EPA for not doing something that is mandatory under the Clean Water Act. And one of the things that's mandatory under the Clean Water Act is that they oversee all the delegated states to make sure that all the delegated states are implementing all the delegated programs appropriately. So that was what the petition to EPA in 2022 was about. So they petitioned EPA and said, hey, you are not doing this. A&R is not appropriately implementing the program. When a state is not appropriately implementing a program, A&R has two options. They can order a corrective action or they can withdraw the delegated program. And when they withdraw the delegated program, they take back everything. They don't just take back one component of it where you might be failing. They take it all back. Or that's the threat. They never actually have taken it all back. They kind of were threatening Wisconsin with that. And Wisconsin was like, oh, it's my bad. It's our bad. We'll fix it. And they fixed it. But it took 10 years for Wisconsin to fix it. But nobody's actually had their delegation, to my knowledge, withdrawn. But it's a fear. It's a hook, right? It's like you don't want EPA running your wastewater programs. You don't want EPA running your construction general permit because that's what you need for development. You don't want EPA running your municipal stormwater MS4 program. You don't want that, right? Like, I don't think EPA wants it either, but so that is what the petition was about, and specifically that because A&R was not appropriately implementing the CAFO discharge permit program, because it hadn't issued a permit to any CAFO that had a discharge, that they were not appropriately implementing delegated programs, and EPA needed to order a corrective action or they needed to withdraw all of the program. And EPA agreed. EPA agreed and said A&R wasn't appropriately implementing the program. And specifically, they said that A&R personnel must inspect all potentially jurisdictional farms to determine if a CAFO permit is required, meaning there's an actual discharge. A&R personnel must review nutrient management plans and issue CAFO permits consistent with state and federal requirements. A&R must comprehensively track permitting, monitoring, and enforcement. A&R must enforce against farms that are discharging without a permit. A&R must have sufficient personnel to fully implement the requirements. And A&R must seek the necessary statutory, regulatory authority to fully implement the Clean Water Act requirements. That's you. You're number 6 on the list. What they need is what they need from you. And A&R must include a reasonable but expeditious timeline, including a date certain for completion of the corrective action plan. Well, A&R issued a response. The response was largely point by point in response to EPA's concern. They're going to go do investigations. They're going to determine if point source discharges are required. They're going to do those investigations with the Agency of Agriculture. the two agencies shall share data management. They'll jointly look at nutrient management plans. ANR will review them on their own as well. They will develop an updated Vermont CAFO rule, and they will seek what's necessary from the legislature. But it continues to have the two different programs. It's the Agency of Ag Water Quality Programs. It has an ANR CAFO permit program. That's not what the advocates are looking for. The advocates are looking for a transfer of the entire ag water quality program from the Agency of Ag to the Agency of Natural Resources. Well, that's not going to be easy. And it may not be as simple as it sounds because, for example, the Ag Water Quality Program at the Agency of Ag, they have engineers there. Rob Achilles, anybody know Rob Achilles, his team. So Rob helps farmers meet the engineering requirements for NRCS loans and grants to ensure that they're meeting the federal standards. And so Rob probably needs to stay at the Agency of Agriculture because the NRCS program isn't going to, because that's an agency, that's an ag program. So that's probably not going to shift. So who stays at agriculture and who shifts? I don't know. That's a decision, policy decision. How much of the budget shifts? I don't know. That's a policy decision. When does it shift? I don't know. That's a policy decision. Now, that type of thing, if you're going to shift the program, you're going to have to work through some of that detail. And I don't have answers for you on that. So, I just want to end with the Clean Water Initiative from 2020 is showing progress. And it's showing a lot of that progress from agriculture, showing a lot of the agricultural conservation projects or practices are cost effective. That a ton of the reduction is associated with those annual practices. But again, ANR has not issued a CAFO permit. And there are discharges. There are farms that are discharging. There's records of farms that have been under enforcement actions, ordered to correct an issue, haven't corrected it. The issue is ongoing. And that's something that EPA wants permitted as a CAFO permit. Now, what would you do under a CAFO permit? So what's the difference? There's really not a lot of difference. Under the CAFO permit, you're prohibited from discharging, except for the 24-hour storm. Like you get a pass if the storm event is just too much and creates a discharge. You don't get that pass in Vermont. In Vermont, you can't have that discharge. What the other difference is the amount of penalties and the mechanism for penalties for a NPDES permit and the amount of public participation, public review for a NPDES permit is more significant. So that's really the substantive standard of how much of a discharge you can have is pretty much the same. How that permit is implemented and the transparency and regulation, nutrient management plans would be fully public. They'd be part of the permit. So there's that type of consideration. And there's so much more. There's so much more. There's wetlands, there's basin planning, there's stream all, there's the use of surface waters. Wake boats are still an issue. I'm sure you've heard about wake boats and they're still an issue. CSOs, PFAS, surface water diversion, microplastics, we just kind of touched the surface of water quality law and how it's impacting ag currently. I do want to note that I do think the agencies want clean water. I do think they're trying to work towards that goal. I think they sincerely attempt to preserve and improve the waters of the state. Fortunately, achieving that goal is harder and will have a longer term for success than most would hope.
If we start from the position that the state needs to do what EPA requires the state to do, then it's a question of either interpreting what EPA is requiring us to do, or what, and where is the daylight between position that one group of people might have and position that other group of people might have.
I think the first response to that is it really depends on how EPA responds to what A&R and the state has proposed as a corrective action. I think they were supposed to get back to the state last week, but I don't think they did. Did they respond?
I haven't read it yet, but so many bucks.
Yes, they responded.
They did. So I haven't seen that yet, so I don't know what it says. Was it positive or negative?
Depends on what side you sit on.
My understanding was way towards A&R still. Yeah. Control the program enforcement.
I read the letter and it was, the tone was rather friendly, I would say, rather than antagonistic. But beyond that, I don't know that I have enough knowledge to interpret what the details were. So, okay.
So I think EPA can express its desire to have A&R run the whole program. I don't think EPA has the authority to say that the state can no longer have an ag water quality program. I think EPA has the authority to say that A&R needs to run the CAFO permitting program better, and they would prefer that it would all be an A&R. And I don't think they can require that. Now, what would that mean if the advocates still wanted to shift the entire program? Well, I think that would mean litigation. I think what the advocates could request in litigation is withdrawal and or additional corrective action. And then, during litigation, the state can always be like, well, this is what we're offering to do to settle the litigations. So I think that that's where you are. I need to read the EPA letter. I haven't read it yet. It's kind of where you are.
Representative.
Yeah, really appreciate this expose and your time discussing. It's just a reflection as a rep who sits on the Ag Forestry Committee. I have so many constituent dissatisfaction, complaints, struggles in their dealings with the A&R. Now, that's not meant to, that's just factual dissatisfaction and disruption to lives and it's not trying to be negative about the agency per se and their serious responsibilities. But the fact that we have a voice in creating policy, my instincts are that, and having worked with the agency of Ag for previous biennium, my gut tells me that I would much rather advocate to have the authority rest significantly in the agency of ag, just a comment.
You have to give some authority to A&R, and they already technically have that
They
authority.
have it.
They already have that authority to require a permit from a CAFO,
No, I can't.
but they just haven't been required.
Who is in charge of the municipalities, the wastewater treatment facilities, they are as well?
Yes, they're the one that has jurisdiction over them, yes.
And over any other areas that we might have seen on the list or that,
Yeah, so your wastewater treatment, your industrial discharges, like say from Vermont Yankee was one, Global Foundries, breweries often have them. Those are industrial discharges of A&R permits and Cabot. Then there's what's called the MS4 permit, the municipal separate storm sewer system permit, which is required for basically certain urbanized areas. And they have to go out and they have to do a lot of storm water treatment practices and mitigation. So that's your larger towns in Vermont, plus some that they've added with their authority that's called residual designation. Then there's the industrial stormwater program, which is called the multi-sector general permit, which requires certain classified industrial sites to put in certain stormwater controls depending on the type of industry it is. And then there's the construction general permit, stormwater permit. The federal level, if you're going to disturb an acre or more of land, you need to do certain stormwater management practices. In Vermont, it's a half acre or more.
and there's A&R that's.
A&R is delegated all of that authority from EPA.
And in everything, in all these rules, A&R, the state of Vermont, has set themselves to a higher standard than the EPA rules. All of them that I know of.
I would say most of them. I would say wastewater treatment, there are other jurisdictions with higher standards than in Vermont.
So, my people in my business that farm in New York or New Hampshire have far more liberties than we do in Vermont. They don't have a wintertime spreading ban. They have rules. They don't have a ban. And they have protection from that 25-year rain event, which 25-year rain event isn't much of a stretch, especially these days, whereas we don't have that luxury. I will say there's been considerations given from big rain events. And the agency of ag knows how to find, and A&R knows how to find as well. And I realize they've never written a CAFO permit. I don't know why, but perhaps that they sent a corrective action letter along with a fine and it was taken care of, so they didn't need to make the permit.
That's why I gave that example of the failure of the custom applicator. And that's obviously on one end of the spectrum,
One and done.
right? But where do the agencies say you can take that corrective action and don't need the permit? That's really a question for the agencies.
Yeah.
Well, we have really only scratched the surface here in such a detailed presentation. Thanks for putting this together, Mike. And as we just heard, it's already out of date because there was new information that came from the EPA that we need to add to the record. So we'll stop there for now and we've got Mike scheduled to come back in tomorrow on a different topic, Mike, but if you want to continue this, if you have more information that you'd like to share, and I'll ask the committee too, if they want to spend a little time with more questions, because I suspect that maybe there were more questions. We can devote some of the time tomorrow to this topic as well. In any case, we'll take a break for lunch and we'll be back at 1. Good.
Thank you, Martin.
Yeah.